Hello, my name is Joep Hofhuis, and I am here to present to you a study that I conducted together with my colleagues Joran Jongerling and Jeroen Jans on the topic of how students develop their multicultural personality traits during a full year of attending an international university program. Um, Before I get started, I would like to share with you a quote from the website of our program, which states that we aim to equip our students with the knowledge, insights, and skills that enable them to make an important and inspiring contribution to a society that is becoming increasingly more international and in which diversity plays a major role. And basically, what this shows you is that the mission statement of our faculty and our university programs is to enhance our students' abilities to, interact successfully with people from different cultural backgrounds. And essentially what this means is we're trying to teach them intercultural competences. And this is not unique. I think a lot of university programs around the world are doing this and are at least have this as one of their goals. The question that remains, of course, is are we successful at that? Are we actually teaching our students intercultural competences? And if so, what does that mean? Does that make them function better during the program itself? How do they develop themselves across that program, and how does that relate to these competences? So, these are the things that we were interested in studying. Before we get into the details, of course, there are many different ways in which you can measure intercultural competences. There's hundreds of different frameworks out there. And the one we are working with is multicultural personality. Specifically, we're using the Multicultural Personality Questionnaire developed by Karen van der Zee and Jan-Pieter van Oudenhoven in the early 2000s. And the MPQ has been shown to be one of the most robust and most reliable intercultural competence measures out there. And it's interesting because it was initially developed as really a personality questionnaire, so something that is measuring stable traits of individuals that can predict how effective they are in intercultural interactions. But over time, studies have shown that MPQ scores, so personality traits in this case, are also dynamic, so they can change over time. And that's why we thought it would be interesting to look at how they change among our university students across a year of being in our program. MPQ consists of 5 subscales. They are roughly based on the Big Five personality traits, except specified specifically towards intercultural context. And cultural empathy is the ability of people to understand and put yourself in the shoes of those with a different cultural background. Emotional stability is about dealing with or coping with intercultural stress. Flexibility is about being flexible in your behaviors and adjusting your behaviors to different situations. Open-mindedness reflects the inherent curiosity that people have, or they're being non-judgmental towards other cultures. And social initiative is much more about the interaction, so initiating social contact and communication with people who are different. And these 5 traits have been shown to relate to all kinds of intercultural outcomes, specifically intercultural attitudes like aspirations, right? So people who score high on these are more likely to want to go abroad for work or study. It relates to acculturation. It relates to diversity beliefs in the workplace. There's some studies that relate MPQ to behavior, not so many, but we've shown that it enhances people's effectiveness in intercultural interactions, and it enhances their ability to do intercultural communication in the workplace. And finally, there's lots of relationships that have been shown with intercultural outcomes like productivity, especially in diverse teams and organizations. Student adaptation, right? So MPQ traits help people adapt to their new environment, and also things like physical and mental health among students or expatriates. So either way, these are all interesting findings. And as I said, the aim of our study program is to enhance intercultural competences. So what we're doing is we're testing whether or not these MPQ traits develop over time in our program. That's the first research question that we formulated. How do these scores develop during the first year specifically of being in our program? The second research question then, of course, is what is their relationship with outcomes? Is it so that students who score high on these traits or develop these traits experience less stress, more life satisfaction, and also do they do better in our program? Do they have higher grades, very basically? And finally, the third question, and this is to me the most interesting one, is can we identify certain types or groups of students who are more likely to develop these traits over time, who are more susceptible to being in our program. Now, before we do that, of course, the big question is, are we able to reliably measure these multicultural personality traits? And as I said, we use the multicultural personality questionnaire. The original one is quite long. It's 90 items, which is very long for a longitudinal study like ours. So we've been using the short form, which is 40 items. So that means 8 items per trait, per dimension. And the first part of this project was to make sure that these scales perform well. So we tested measurement of variance between male and female students to see if they performed equally. And very importantly, we also looked at Western versus non-Western students and to see if the scales performed equally well among both groups, make sure there's no cultural bias in our measurements. And finally, we also, because we're doing longitudinal work, we also tested measurement of variance between 2 time points. I'm not going to bore you with all the details. If you're interested, you can read our paper on this. But the bottom line is that the scale, the MPQ short form, performed very well in all of these tests and is reliable among different groups of students and also across time. So that's good news. And that allows us to go back and study to answer the questions that we just formulated. So a little bit about the sample. Our student program is a bachelor program in social sciences and humanities. Everything is taught exclusively in English. Students also have to show test scores to be admitted. So we're assuming that everybody has a good enough level of English to participate. And we aim to have our student body consist of 50% local students from the Netherlands and 50% international students from basically all over the world. This is for the sample that we use for this study. So this is across 2 academic years. We have a total of 425 students participating, and these are the countries that the international students will come from. So half of our sample is Dutch, 46%, and the other half is international from all kinds of different places all over the globe. These are first year students, so they're mostly 18 or 19 years old. And across the year, some of them turn 19 or 20. A little bit more girls than boys, so 72% female students. And finally, one important variable that we will come back to later on is we also measured how, if any of our students had prior international experience before starting our program, which meant have they lived abroad outside their home country for more than 6 months. And about 10% of our students have that experience. So that's 44, I believe, out of the 425. Our measures, so we submitted, we sent out surveys to all of our students 3 times during the first year, once in October at the beginning of the year, once at the end of the semester in February, and then again at the end of the second semester in June, which means that if we're looking at the development of our variables across time, we can basically see that development of semester 1 is the change in between T1 and T2, and the development across semester 2 is the change between T2 and 3. We measured the MPQ at all of these time points. We measured stress and life satisfaction at all of these time points. And as I just explained, prior international experience was measured only at T1. And then we got some data from the program administration itself. So we got the grade point average of all of our students at the end of the year. And they also gave us information about gender, age, and nationality. So that tells us whether a student is local or international. Well, so this was the sample and the measures. But let's get into the results. So firstly, how do these MPQ scores develop over that first year? Interestingly enough, we do not, oh yeah, sorry, these are the tables with all the data. I'm not going to go through all of it. If you're interested, feel free to pause the video and have a look. But the first, this tells us the development of these 5 traits over the first year. And interestingly, on average, we don't see a significant increase or decrease. But what we do see is individual variance. So that means some students go up, some stay the same, and some go down. But over the whole sample, we don't really see a significant increase in any of the 5 dimensions. What we do see is that when you compare the development across a semester, you see that people who start off low develop more, whereas people that start off high develop less. And so that means or it suggests that there might be ceiling effects present, right? Where people, when they develop up to a certain point, once you get closer to that, you stop developing as much. And this is consistent with what we call the maturity stability principle in personality research, which says the same thing. So as people develop certain traits, their kind of the rate of development kind of goes down until they reach a certain ceiling point. And we see that same thing here with these 5 traits. So that's an interesting finding already. Second question is, how does it relate? How do these traits relate to stress, satisfaction, and academic performance? Regarding stress, what is interesting is that we see that in the first semester, emotional stability acts as a buffer. So people that score high on that trait feel less stressful. But in semester 2, emotional stability no longer has that effect, but instead cultural empathy and flexibility do. And what we think might be happening here is that in the first semester, the students are dealing with intercultural stress, culture shock, basically. They're either moving to a new country, or they're all of a sudden find themselves in a new international environment, and emotional stability helps them cope with that. Whereas this is probably in semester 2 is the kind of stress that is inherent within a university program. So having to work together and take courses and do tests and write papers and all those things. So it appears that cultural empathy and flexibility are reducing stress at that point. We don't see any effects on life satisfaction, surprisingly. So scoring high on the MPQ does not make you happier, which is an interesting finding. And finally, we see that cultural empathy and social initiative are both positively related to grades, to academic performance. That might have to do something with the way our program is set up. So we ask of our students that they do a lot of group work, especially with also people who are culturally different, right? So having this empathy and having a social initiative will probably help them do that and help them score better grades. And then finally, the third research question, which students are more likely to develop? So as I said, we have people that go up, we have people that stay the same, we have people that decrease. So we try to figure out if we could predict that from certain characteristics of the students. We looked first at gender and age to see if there were any effects there, and there were none. So there's no differences between male and female students, or the ones who are 18 or 19 or a little bit older. Next, we looked at the effects of cultural background, so local versus international students. And also there, we don't see, across the whole sample, we don't see any significant differences. So local and international students on average develop similarly. However, once we added the prior international experience variable to the model, things started to change, and we find an interaction between international experience and the local versus international variable. And I will show you how that works. It works specifically on 2 traits. The first one is open-mindedness, where you see that most students, so these lines are the development of open-mindedness across T1, T2, and T3. These differences are not significant. So we see that most students kind of start at the same level and on average kind of stay the same, except one group, which is the local students with no prior experience. So it appears that everybody who's an international student or who has already lived abroad before scores fairly high on open-mindedness. Could be self-selection effects, or could be previous learning effects, we don't know. But the people who don't have that experience start lower, but they catch up really quickly. So within 1 semester of being in our program, they've caught up to the other groups. They are now, again, all equal. And we find a very similar effect for the dimension social initiative, where again, most of these groups score fairly similarly and kind of on average, stay about the same, except the locals with no prior experiences. They catch up to the other groups fairly soon, or at least they improve much more in the first semester and then kind of level up. So that is interesting. And what that tells us is that the international study environment seems to be most beneficial for the students who have not had such experiences before. Right? So the internationals are already self-selecting a bit, so they already score fairly high on these traits before they come to our program. And the locals who already have prior experience also score high. So it's the kind of the ones who are doing this kind of thing for the first time that benefit the most. And that, I think, is an interesting finding, because most university programs try to aim to enhance everybody's intercultural competences. But what we are seeing is that the presence of all the international students helps the locals, particularly those with no experience, prior experience, develop themselves more quickly. So those are the main findings. Of course, there's lots of future directions and lots of ideas of other studies that you could do with this. I'm personally very curious how this develops beyond that first year. So what happens in year 2 and 3, or maybe even into a master's or even a PhD program. So that will be the next step in this research line. I'm also curious in looking at different kinds of programs, right? This is social science and humanities. What happens when you look at medical school or the law school or things like that? Could we find differences there? One other thing that's interesting is that in year 2, where students go on an international exchange. So I'm very curious if you see developments based on that, and if certain groups of students maybe benefit more from such an exchange than others do. And finally, I already said that one of the parts of our program is based around intercultural interaction, intercultural group work. So of course, with this kind of method, we can also tease out the effects of these group interactions and try to figure out how the MPQ plays a role in determining behavior in those kinds of group settings. Anyways, thank you very much for your attention. I'm very curious to hear your ideas or thoughts about our work. So feel free to send me an email or drop me a line. And I very much look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.